Good afternoon. My name is Seth, and I'm one of the range masters at the Colonial Williamsburg Musket Range.
And I'm Justin Chapman. I'm a manager of the Department of Historic Trades and Skills and the supervisor of the Musket Range. Musket Range began about 5 years ago, 2016, and the experience basically was born out of the idea that people have come to us periodically when they've seen musket demonstrations and other things and said, well, that's great, and I really enjoyed that, but I want to do it. Where can I try this? And up to then, there wasn't really any place to really do that in a controlled setting, especially if you didn't already own something like that or know someone who did. And so this experience was born out of the idea that it's great to learn about history, but there are times, especially with certain activities, that you really want to be able to put the thing in your hand and try it and feel the weight and smell how it smells when you fire it. And so to that extent, then, we have quite a few guns that we could have selected for the range, and I'm going to let Seth tell you a little bit more about the ones that we have.
So one of the more common questions that we get at the musket range is, how do you actually load these firearms? So today we decided to demonstrate that. Now for this, right now we have 3 of these firearms here, although 2 of them are the ones that we commonly utilize at the range, while the third is kind of a contrast piece. So the first is a fowling piece, or again what today you might call a shotgun. The second is the American long rifle, and the third is the British shortland pattern musket. So all these are going to be loaded a little bit differently. So what we've done is demonstrate in detail how all of these are going to be loaded. So for this, when we watch the demonstration, if you have any questions or anything, feel free afterwards that we're going to come back and then answer any you might have. But for now, we'll go ahead and check out the demonstration. Hello and welcome to the musket range. So as we're out here, we're going to be demonstrating 3 different types of firearms. So these are some of the more common that you're going to find here in North America, or at least some of the ones that we're most commonly asked about. Now, to begin with, what we're going to start with is the fowling piece, and that's this firearm right here. Now, when discussing either the fowling piece or the American long rifle or the British shortland pattern musket that we will be discussing, what we're going to be using for all of these will be the flintlock mechanism. That's this mechanism right here. Now, for all these firearms to work, obviously our secret ingredient is going to be gunpowder. Gunpowder will be loaded into the barrel of the firearm, and that is going to create that expansion, that propulsion, which propels the projectile down the barrel. So the question becomes, how do we ignite that gunpowder in the first place? So for this, we have the flintlock. Now for the flintlock, what we have in the jaws here is a piece of flint. That's a rock. It is harder than steel, and it is razor sharp on the edge. So when it strikes steel, it tends to shave off just a little bit of that steel, and through friction it superheats it up, which is more than a significant temperature to ignite that gunpowder that we're going to place in this powder pan. So what we have here is our steel, our flint, our gunpowder will be placed in that pan, and next to that pan is a little tiny hole that goes right into the barrel called the vent. So for this, once we shut our pan, we've sealed in that gunpowder, then we have flint striking steel, which of course creates sparks. Those sparks rain down, contacting the gunpowder, burst a flame in every direction, most importantly, through that vent, strike the main charge, discharging the firearm. So mechanically speaking, that's how all of these firearms work, be it Fowler or rifle or musket. Now with this in mind, the first firearm that we're going to be focusing on is going to be the Fowler right here. Now this Fowler or fowling piece is something analogous today to something like a shotgun. So this can fire buckshot, bird shot, solid shot, swan shot, so whatever you need, so versatility. Beyond this, it is by far the most commonly owned firearm here in North America, and this is by virtue of what you need it for. In the 18th century, the primary reason that you're buying a firearm is that you have a need. And in the 18th century, the most common need that would require this is going to be the trade of agriculture. So if you're a farmer. So if you're a farmer, you have your investment planted all around the house. Your products are there out in the fields. But the biggest threat to that investment is going to be, well, critters. Fuzzy bunnies, deer, that sort of thing. So if you want to stay in business, meet pest control. So good for keeping rabbits out of the garden, putting dinner on the table. Smoothbore fowling piece. So with this in mind, the way that we are going to load this fowling piece today, and we're going to start here, is that we are going to utilize kind of a process of building a shotgun shell inside of the barrel, as you might know it today. So down here, what we have is our ingredients. Now, we're not able to put gunpowder out on the table right now because this is a cold range, and obviously we don't want live powder happening when the range is cold, but it's going to be right here in the back end. In front of that, we're going to have this piece of felt. Now, this is an old sacrificed hat that's given its life for the cause, but in either case, what you want to use is something solid, but not solid like wood or metal or anything like that, but you can use a piece of felt like this, you can use wadded up linen, you can even use an old paper wasp nest. But in front of that, what you want to have is your buckshot, or your bird shot in this case. So these pellets will be loaded next in front of that felt piece. And on top of that, again, a linen wadding, or could even be something as basic as grass wadding to hold that all in place as we are building that shotgun inside of that barrel. Next, as we move to the lock, we will simply be putting gunpowder into that pan, after which time we shut the pan. And now the firearm is ready to operate. Simply bring it all the way back to the full cock, remove the hammer stall, and then when that flint strikes that steel, we get the sparks, igniting that powder, firing our made shotgun shell. So with that in mind, we're going to load this and actually fire to kind of demonstrate this process in action.
Range is hot!
Now we're ready to load our fowling piece, and right now, to do this, we've made the range hot. Now what that means out here is that when our range is hot, it's a term that we use at the musket range, meaning that live fire will be taking place. The opposite of this, of course, is range cold, meaning that no firing will be taking place and the range is clear. But since our range is hot right now, you'll notice I'm wearing eye and ear protection for this. So in order to load our fowling piece, what I'm going to start out with is the powder horn. Now, most importantly, you never want to load straight from the horn to the barrel. In that case, how would you know how much gunpowder you're putting down the barrel in the first place? So instead, what we have is a powder measure. This powder measure is going to allow me to measure exactly the amount of grains of gunpowder that I need in order to fire. So I'm going to start by uncapping my powder horn, then pouring that powder into that measure. So now that I've filled that, capping my horn back, I am then going to load from this measure into the barrel itself. Alright, so now I have emptied all of the gunpowder into the barrel, and now it is time for my felt wadding. And again, anything that's going to be able to compress that adequately without being solid, again like metal or wood, is going to be good for this. So, if you got an old wasp nest, a piece of felt, but we're going to start by inserting that felt and then ramming it all the way down. And this is going to create a barrier between that gunpowder and the shot, which comes next. Now the shot will be brought forth from a shot pouch like the one I'm wearing right here. But for the sake of brevity today, for loading, I'm just taking this out of a pre-measured paper tube. But this is all of our birdshot. So now that that's been loaded, our next step, finally going down the barrel, is going to be our linen patch. And again, you can even do something as basic as grass to load this down. The whole idea is to compress, make sure that that birdshot or buckshot, whatever you're loading, doesn't come rolling back out of the barrel. So I start, put it over the end of the barrel, and then simply ram down that linen wadding, making sure that it's properly seated. In which case, our fowling piece is now loaded, so now we need to prime it. So for that, once again, we have our powder horn, which we just upend and pour that powder straight into the pan. And again, always importantly, stopping up our powder horn. Now that this is primed, loaded, and ready to fire, we shut the pan. And that's going to seal in that powder so it doesn't fall out or anything as you're going through the woods. And now we are ready to fire. All we have to do is bring this top jaw here all the way back to the full cock position, and finally removing this leather hammer stall. Now that hammer stall, if this flint were to suddenly go forward right now and strike that steel, it would make sparks, but if it goes forward now, it just strikes leather, and thus no spark, no ignition. So it is kind of our final safety. So since we're ready to fire, I'm going to remove that leather hammer stall, and we are now ready to fire. So with this in mind, aiming down range, aiming at whichever your target it is, and whenever you're ready, pull trigger.
And action.
Now the second firearm that we're going to be utilizing is the American long rifle here. Now the rifle utilizes that same flintlock mechanism that the fowling piece does, but because of the way that the barrel works, it's going to be a little different than a smoothbore fowling piece. So there are lands and grooves that are carved like a spiral inside of this barrel all the way down. So this is the rifling that imparts spin on that spherical projectile. So as a result, it's a very tight-fitting projectile to the barrel itself, unlike, say, that loose buckshot or birdshot that you'd see me pour down the barrel of the fowling piece. So today, what we're going to be loading into the barrel of this gun, first of all, will be gunpowder, carefully measured. And then after that, this greased cloth or leather patch, and wrapped inside of it, your rifle ball. Now, quite often on rifles, back in the buttstock here in this plate, you're going to store, that's called your patch box or your grease box, and that's where you're going to be storing these patches. So once you're ready to load, simply take that patch out and wrap it around the ball itself, fully encasing it. So again, powder down the barrel, and then this patched ball right on top of it. And just like with the fowling piece, after that, we're going to prime that pan, shut pan, flint and steel again. So when it comes to ownership of this firearm, this is a far more specialized piece of equipment. This is a long-range, precision, custom-made firearm quite often, with a cost to match. So as a result, the average American does not own a rifle like this. Just like the fowling piece is going to be very specific to someone involved in agriculture most often, just the same as with a rifle. This is going to be instead utilized by professional hunters. You invest in this piece of equipment because this is how you'll be making your money. So rifles, although very expensive by a firearm standpoint, are also a piece of trade equipment. Just like a blacksmith has an anvil, a hunter has a rifle for this sort of purpose. Again, long-range precision shooting. So that's why you don't really see a lot of Americans owning them, because most Americans, although they hunt, Americans can hunt with a shotgun, certainly, and it costs a whole lot less than a rifle does. So when you think rifle, think precision hunting, professional precision hunting. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and move up to loading and firing the rifle. So now we're ready to load our rifle, and just like with the fowling piece, we're going to use the powder horn. So we start by uncorking our powder horn and pouring that carefully measured powder into our measure made out of horn here. All right. After that, corking our horn, and then upending that measure, pouring the entirety of the contents, as much as we can, down the barrel. Now that we've done that, behind it, we are going to place our rifle ball that is wrapped in a greased patch. It's very tight fitting, so it will require a little bit more effort to ram all the way down the barrel. So now our rifle is loaded and we are ready to move on to priming. So again, just like with the fowling piece, we're going to use our horn for that. And there we are. Now that we shut the pan, our rifle is primed, loaded, and ready to fire. So again, just like last time, we're going to start by bringing this all the way back to the full cock, and finally removing our leather hammer stall. And we are now ready to fire. So aim in at target, and whenever you're ready, pull the trigger. Now the final firearm we're going to be working with today is the British short land pattern musket, which is this firearm right here. Now be it British musket or French or Dutch or German musket, overall a musket is a musket. It is a military firearm, specifically a military firearm. Muskets are designed to do two things and do them very well: shoot a lot and shoot fast. So for this, muskets are going to be smooth bore, so just as smooth on the inside of the barrel as it is on the outside, and they'll be firing an undersized projectile. So this is going to allow a couple things. The first thing that's going to allow is that whenever you fire a flintlock, especially, or firing black powder in general, it is very, very dirty, as you can see right there. So all that carbon buildup. So that is going to be building up inside of this barrel, and over time it's going to clog it up. Sometimes it can clog it up fairly quickly. So with that undersized projectile, with that smooth barrel, you have plenty of room. You can keep on loading and firing and loading and firing and loading and firing. You'll likely run out of ammunition before you clog this firearm up. So that is one reason, volume, is that you have that smooth barrel undersized projectile. And the second reason is ease of loading. With an undersized projectile, that allows you to very quickly load that next projectile down the barrel. So for these reasons, obviously you are sacrificing a little bit of accuracy. So ultimately though, what you really want here is volume of fire, speed, volume, shooting as much as you need to. So for this, we're going to load the musket today a little bit different than we loaded the first two civilian firearms. So unlike with a powder horn, for the purposes of speed, we are going to be using a military style cartridge. So inside this cylindrical paper tube is all the gunpowder that you need for one shot, so there's no need for a powder horn. Now, there is no gunpowder in here because, again, we're at a cold range right now, but if you were to tear this open, you can see that on the bottom that we will have that musket ball encased within this paper tube. So, with this in mind, what's going to happen is that when we're ready, we bite open this cartridge, as you might have seen depicted before, but that's the easiest way really to tear it open quickly, is to bite it open with your mouth. Then pour a little gunpowder, once again, into that priming pan, just like with a rifle. So you'll notice we do this kind of backwards. So for a military gun, we're priming first and loading second. After that, that's when you're casting the musket about, upending that cartridge and putting everything down the barrel, then using the ramrod to seat it home. And again, this is all designed to load this as fast as possible and for as much repeat firing as possible. So that's really the notion behind this. You also might notice that there are no sights on this firearm. So as a musket, when you are leveling it on the battlefield, you are kind of matching the angle of the person to your right all the way down. So you're not so much focused on precision aim with this like you would be for a rifle or even a Fowler. Instead, you're all firing together. So it also has a very long, deliberate trigger pull. So again, we want to have unity of fire. When a company of soldiers, 60 to 100, whatever your numbers are, when they fire together, it should be one big shot. So for that, timing, uniformity is going to be essential to this firearm, which is another advantage of the cartridge. So when it comes to loading these, we are loading all of them with a uniform projectile. So 69 caliber musket ball in the case of this 75 caliber British musket. So every soldier has the same caliber. This way we can exchange ammunition if we need to for whatever reason. But again, uniformity is the big key with this firearm. It's much heavier. As far as the stock is constructed, it's built for close combat. It even has a different balance. If you were to pick this up and put it in your shoulder, you notice it's a bit more front heavy perhaps than you might be accustomed to, and because this is designed not just as a firearm, but also as a fighting spear. But here on the range, as we're going to be firing this today, we're just utilizing the firearm component. So we'll go ahead and load and shoot that and show you just how it's a bit faster, several times faster than either Fowler or rifle is.
You get me now? All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed that. Now that we've kind of gone through the three different long barrel guns that we have and how they're loaded and how they've been shot, we thought we'd take some of your questions, and we know you've amassed a few over the course of the video. So we'll just see if we've got any to start off with, and we'll start there.
Excellent. Well, first off, thank you both so much, Seth and Justin, for joining us this afternoon. For our first question, I was wondering if you might be able to provide a little bit more information on the varying lengths of the barrels in these firearms.
Absolutely. And I'll just take that because Seth very ably took the last several minutes of your time showing you how they worked. So you've got a fowling piece, a rifle, and a musket again to kind of go through. And when people talk about a long gun barrel, in modern culture, almost always they're referring to accuracy as the reason why a barrel might be long. And that's not wrong in the case of this gun, and it adds some in the case of the other two, but really that's the stock and trade of a rifle. So a rifle has a long barrel really for two different reasons. The first is that the length will give it extra guidance, so it gives it a longer distance that it's going to be guided as far as the projectile to spin. It also adds distance between the sights, which again makes it more accurate. And also, and this is going to sound a little counterintuitive in the beginning, the fact that and this has diminishing returns after a while, but the fact that it's actually tougher for that rifle to spin the bullet out means it has more time to build pressure behind the bullet. So ironically, restraining it actually makes it come out faster. So that, again, will give you more accuracy. But that's only one gun. It turns out that there's a couple more reasons why we might want a longer gun. So in the case of the musket back here, the British Shortland Service Pattern musket, you'll notice this implement right on the end here. So the bayonet, now no one really would ever accuse a musket of being terribly accurate, although it's nowhere near as inaccurate as people constantly portray it. But the fact is that the reason its length is as long as it is quite frankly just to put the bayonet further out from the musket itself. So it gives you additional room to use it as a hand-to-hand combat implement. Finally, you got the Fowler here. And the Fowler is adept at using a patched ball, as you saw demonstrated about the rifle. So it can fire that same way, although it lacks the grooving to make as much guidance. So the length of the barrel, to an extent, will help guide it still. But in the case of the Fowler, it also happens to fire shot, as you saw Seth again very ably demonstrate. And so, actually, can we pull up a picture of the shot interior of the Fowler? Okay, so you can see these projectiles, and you'll see on that picture there's the gunpowder, as Seth was talking about it, and you've got a couple of modern wads that we've kind of shown to kind of give you more comparative value. And then in front of that, you've got the shot pellets. So you're going to have, again, a wad that has to go between the powder and the shot, and then another wad that goes on top of the shot to keep it in place. But you can see those pellets. There's quite a few of them there. And so this long barrel, the longer it is, the steeper the spray pattern of those pellets as they come out. So if you had a very short barrel, it would come out fanned out very wide, and you can find a gun that does that in the 18th century called a blunderbuss. On the other hand, if you were trying to shoot ducks or geese or something like that, waterfowl, hence the name fowling piece, they tend to be quite a distance away from you, especially if they're flying, and in which case then you're going to need to be able to reach out with some degree of distance and make sure that at least some of those projectiles are going to hit. And that's kind of the idea. The longer the barrel, the better the pattern, the more reach you have with it.
Now, we've had a few questions about flash guards, actually, and Michael specifically was wondering, would it have been common in the 18th century for these firearms to have flash guards?
I'll take that one again. No, that's a real quick answer. Not that I've ever seen evidence for. We have both two different safety features, and thanks for picking that up, Seth. So you've got the flash guard that he's pointing at there. It goes right on the edge of the priming pan. I'm also going to point out the hammer stall there, which is that leather piece that's hanging off. Now, you can certainly find military evidence of the hammer stall being used in the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars, but I still have not yet seen evidence of a hammer stall on a civilian gun. Now, in the case of the flash guard, no, we don't see that. And then the next logical question is to ask, why do we have them? And the answer is, it's really hard to ignore a safety device when you've got one available. And so in this case, the flash guard's really principal purpose is in military applications to stop, if you're firing in rank, the person right next to you from getting hit with your priming charge. But in the case of the musket range, it also serves a very practical purpose, which is when Seth and I are instructing, if we're standing near to you with the gun and we're perpendicular to you to watch how you're shooting and to make sure you're doing everything you need to do correctly, that keeps us from getting sprayed with that same priming charge. So we use them along with the hammer stall. Again, that stops a spark from being made. It's a safety device, and it helps us keep the range as safe as possible because that is our first and foremost priority.
So building off of that, Susie was wondering what type of danger is involved in putting too much powder into the pan itself.
So when it comes to loading up the pan, so as you're loading this pan, when it comes to danger, the biggest issue is that, well, And in the cases of a lot of newer people, they think more is better. Put more gunpowder in there, which means guaranteed spark, guaranteed flash. The problem is you also get a much bigger fireball. So if you put too much powder in that pan and it ignites, then it can create such a massive fireball that you get a free gunpowder haircut or half an eyebrow. Ask me how I know. But either way, the other issue that you can face is also if you overfill that pan, then it won't actually properly shut, and you can actually drop any of your powder that's in that priming pan out, and it'll fall down on the ground. So if you're doing like the manual of arms with a military musket and you bring it up like so, then that powder is dumping out, and when you pull the trigger, well, there's no powder left to contact. So that can be a functional issue, but again, just that big fireball is the chief concern. So that's really kind of what you see if you put too much powder in the pan. Ideally, what you're aiming for is just to lightly fill this pan. So just kind of nice, clean, level surface.
Now, Russ was curious about the differences in both accuracy, but then also distance-wise, how far these projectiles would travel between each firearm.
So in terms of the different guns you got here, one thing we really need to specify is a difference between how far the projectile will go versus how far you can accurately use it. And that makes a major difference between these two in the back. So the Fowler, accurately with a patched ball, you could shoot a deer maybe out to 100 yards of just about as accurately as the rifle. And from there, the rifle completely wins. And so the rifle, it depends on what you're looking at in terms of references, but there are documented shots of people being hit on purpose in the Revolutionary War with a rifle in excess of 400 yards. So it is easily capable of doing that. The rifle, as we've tested it, can, if you charge it correctly, be ejecting the bullet in the neighborhood of close to 2,000 feet per second. So that's fairly close to a modern rate of travel, depending on what kind of rifle you're using. The musket, on the other hand, can easily throw its projectile 500 yards. You don't have a prayer of hitting anything at that range whatsoever. And it depends again on whose reference you want to look at as far as trying to figure out the accuracy of the musket. We can say comfortably that in military terms, you can hit a man-sized target to a distance of probably at least around 75 yards. I've seen quotes of as much as 100 and as little as 60, but having shot them myself, I tend to believe it's a bit more than that. So.
Now, Julia had a question historically about the American War for Independence and how soldiers were being armed. Specifically, she was wondering if the colonists that fought in the Revolution were issued firearms or if they brought their own personal weapons.
So when it comes to the issuance of firearms, so the government is going to have predominantly military firearms. So they are trying to build up a stockpile as best they can of the military-style guns, like the British musket here. One of the biggest issues that we've faced leading up to the American Revolution, really throughout the American Revolution, is logistics. So the problem that we have is that most of our firearms, especially almost all of our military firearms, are produced in Europe. So if you're serving in the Continental Army, you're likeliest to be carrying a French-made musket, or a British musket, or German musket, Dutch musket, Spanish musket, but either way, and then maybe some very small amount of American-made muskets. And these will all be government-issued to soldiers. So if you enlist in the Continental Army, then you are issued your musket, your cartridge box, your ammunition, all of that is provided to you. Now, where we get the idea of the Americans bringing their own firearms comes from the militia. So if you are serving in the militia, when you think of militia service, I always like to compare it to jury duty. When you report to jury duty today, the government doesn't give you clothes. You got to show up, dress nicely for jury duty. So when you show up to militia service, you are bringing everything from home, including your firearm. So you're required to bring a long arm, something like these. Again, most commonly what you're going to see, because most people own fowling pieces, the most common firearm that you're going to see American colonists bringing to that militia service will be the fowling piece here. So always an edged weapon like a long knife or a belt axe or something like that. So when you talk about military service, you're talking exclusively about government issue guns like this. Predominantly. Early war is kind of sketchy as far as where the the Proto-Continental Army is kind of getting their equipment from. But predominantly throughout the Revolution, you're going to see military guns like these issued to soldiers. Again, they're acquired from typically European sources, beg, borrow, stolen. You see British shipping that is preyed upon by American privateers, stealing whatever's not nailed down from those British resupply ships and then issuing them out to soldiers. So, and that includes not just military guns like these, but even things as basic as uniforms. So you can see all that kind of provided to soldiers from the army. But again, when you talk about militias that show up, well, for the militia, it's whatever gun you brought from home. So I guess the short answer is both. You could see guns that are issued to professional soldiers by the government, and for the militia that shows up, they're bringing their own guns.
There's also, in the beginning of the war, as you said, the supply's a little sketchy, but Virginia does, for a period of time, offer bounties for people who enlist with their own gun.
Yep.
So when we're short on supply, you got to get it any way you can get it. So absolutely. And a lot of those people formerly being in the militia were already required to have a long arm, so they're hoping to get that as part of their prevalent supply.
And you see, as the Continental Army is going up to Boston in the beginning of the war, 1775, there are records of eager American soldiers breaking into suspected loyalist homes and stealing their fowling pieces so they can acquire more firearms that way. So we talk about beg, borrow, steal. Steal you can underline. But yeah, absolutely you see that.
Michael was wondering if you had any type of cost conversion for what, say, an 18th century rifle would have cost in the 18th century, right? What type of high price are we looking at when we're thinking about rifle technology of this period?
So that's kind of a question we would really love to be able to answer well. Now, one of the things that we can say, we can quote prices from the 18th century, and we can even look at, potential amounts of income that would take in. But again, there's a lot of different factors into that. So for instance, trying to talk about a median income in the 18th century is difficult because it depends on what profession, do you occupy as far as making a living. So if you're in agriculture, for instance, how many acres of land are you farming and what kind of crop are you growing as to what your expected median income is probably going to be. If we were to look at these different guns, it also depends on what materials you make them out of. So for instance, you almost never see an iron ramrod on a civilian-made gun because not only is the wood cheaper, but it's also, it's not something that you tend to break as much as you might potentially do it in combat. So materials make a huge difference in the cost of the item that you're buying. And in the case of a rifle, there's a little bit extra in the way of cost for a few extra features that commonly come with it. But again, it's much more on you as to what you want to include with it. What parts is it being made of? Are you using a brass patch box versus a wood patch box? Which one is cheaper? And so when we look at, for instance, a fowling piece, we can find an average price probably in the neighborhood. I think one of the best quotes the gunsmiths have talked about was 21 shillings, which is basically 1 pound, 1 shilling. It would be not outside the realm of possibility to say that a Virginian might expect an income if they were in agriculture of around 10 pounds a year. This is throwing a figure out there. And again, it depends on what you do as to, it may be below that, it may be above that, but not significantly above that. And so you realize that's, a tenth to maybe more of your yearly income, depending on how much you make. And this rifle would generally go for a bit more than that. The highest price I think I've ever seen somebody tell me was about 6 pounds, but that's got a lot of wire inlay and a lot of other really fancy stuff on it. Your average rifle that you're going to shoot with, especially as Seth talked about, to make a living is probably not going to be that expensive. But again, it's going to be firearms are a very expensive tool in the 18th century. And so again, if you're of means, you may have more than one, maybe have a few, but the average person, generally speaking, probably doesn't.
So Doug says we've all heard stories about forgetting to remove the ramrod after loading the gun, and he was curious about what actually happens when, say, you forget to remove the ramrod from the gun after you're loading. Does it damage the weapon, or? So
primarily what happens is your ramrod is then sent across the battlefield at a slower muzzle velocity than the projectile, along with the projectile. That's the short answer. We actually have, there was a skirmish here in Williamsburg. It was a training exercise done earlier in the war between the American militia and the American Continental Army, the Virginia Line. And there actually is a story of these two sides at extreme distances. They're firing blanks, so just gunpowder, no projectile. And one militiaman, of course, leaves that ramrod in, and it gets launched across the field and actually bounces off of the leg of a Continental Army soldier. Doesn't harm him that we see records of. So it's one of those, because of the shape of the ramrod, because of its length, you really don't see a huge amount of muzzle velocity, but what you've really just done is taken one of your prime loading mechanisms and send it that way a few hundred yards. So it's one of those, the biggest hindrance you have is to reloading. But beyond that, although that's wooden or metal ramrod. Metal one would probably go faster, maybe.
So Douglas was curious about the repair on the short land pattern and if this would have been a common repair technique, and if it is indeed a repair, how the fracture in the wood occurred.
Sure. I did that repair, so yay, back to my days as the armorer of military programming. Yes, the stock repair is something that happens, and if you want to hand that over, thank you. In this case, the reason this particular crack happened was because the person who originally cut this stock cut the wood in a very poor fashion, which is to say the grain actually slopes upward, which is exactly what you don't want in a firearm. And so what happens was this crack went straight through the wrist right here, and this is, if it's going to break, usually you're going to look at one of two breaks that happen to a firearm. One will be right through the wrist area, and the other will be somewhere in the forestock area. That's basically the two most common breaks. So if you look at Revolutionary War repairs, and there are some that are still in existence as far as where you'd find pictures. For instance, George Newman's book, Battle Weapons of the Revolutionary War, has a few decent photos. You find that several different materials are used to repair these. Sometimes a plate with screws going into it has been used. Sometimes rawhide or a wire or cord wraps are used to sort of help shore this break up, along with some screws to kind of hold it. In this case, brass is a bit more of an expensive material, so I'm not going to call this a very common repair or the most common way to do this. But in this case, you can see that it's nailed on in place. These are just tacked in here. And this is basically just pounded to fit. Now, if I were to go back and critique my own work, I would say this is actually too well done. If you look at a lot of American repairs especially, I would have probably just hacked the apron of the tang right here, this piece of wood straight off, and just wrapped the brass right over the top of it. I may not have even cut out this area here. I may have just made it difficult to get the lock in and out. There's a lot of them that are much more crudely done, but that's just the way it is. It depends on the skill of the person that's applying the fix. In this case, though, this particular one was applied 10 years ago, and it's still holding strong. So we can say that they work. So it's a pretty decent repair as far as seeing the longevity. But that's, again, it's something that you have to deal with. And in wartime, remember that just like with medicine, just because you see something crudely done doesn't mean that someone isn't capable of doing something rather elegant. It just means that in the setting you're in, you either don't have time or you don't have material to be able to do that, and you're just trying to get it working as fast as possible.
Tina asks, how quickly could an expert load and fire a rifle?
So when it comes to loading and firing a rifle, I've heard people brag that they can do it in 30 seconds. I've never personally seen that. The issue is that rifles are not designed to be loaded for speed, really. And repeat firing, your biggest issue that you're going to run into is carbon buildup. So unlike modern gunpowder, black powder is exceedingly dirty. It's going to start to really build up and build up and build up pretty fast. Now, in the video, I was loading a clean gun, so it goes, that patched ball gets rammed down pretty easily. But as that carbon is just building up and building up and building up in your barrel, it's clogging it up. So yeah, your first shot, you might be able to load that. And again, I've heard 30 seconds, never honestly seen it, but so you might be 30 seconds, but your second shot, you're really going to have to start ramming that next shot down, and there's going to be more resistance for each and every shot. So the more common one I see is maybe 45 seconds to as much as a minute and a half. The other thing about loading a rifle is one thing, but understanding also what you're doing with that rifle. When you're firing a rifle, the notion is precision marksmanship. And if you're engaging with a rifle, ideally, as Justin was saying, 300, 400 yards, you're not going to be able to go, bang. It's all right, I'm aiming in on my target. I'm taking windage into account. I'm monitoring my breathing, making sure breathing in, breathing out. So all of that is really kind of figured into not just loading, but also shooting that rifle. And if you're shooting it effectively, it will take you a longer amount of time. So if you're shooting at something much, much closer, 150 yards or in, then the musket's going to be your optimum weapon for that. But as far as like that long distance shooting, again, like I said, maybe 30 seconds, but that's on a clean weapon for someone who's incredibly good at it, maybe. But 45 seconds, I'd say, is a far more fair estimate. But again, that's just loading it, not accounting for shooting it.
Now, Mandy was wondering if you could describe a bit about caliber in the 18th century and what calibers were most commonly used in military firearms of the American War for Independence.
Sure. Well, caliber, it's an interesting discussion. First off, it's not anywhere near as often used as a term as using the terms bore or gauge. So you're probably familiar with the idea in the modern world of shotgun as a 12 gauge, a 10 gauge, 20 gauge, 16 gauge. And those are the most common that you see now. But in the 18th century, unless you step into military circles, which the question is about, in the civilian world, you don't see a common caliber per se that I would say, because you're making these really to sort of fit the purpose. And so you have a huge selection, and especially if you were to actually have a gunsmith make a gun for you, unless if it weren't already ready-made, then you can almost specify exactly what caliber you want it to be. So if mysteriously you wanted it to be, a 50 bore, meaning 50 bullets to the pound of lead when you cast it. So in the modern world, if you were looking at, say, a 12 gauge, that means, ironically, you can't actually figure it out in the modern world because our projectiles are not the same as where that reference comes from. 12 balls to the pound of lead, full-size balls that fit the barrel exactly. Well, not exactly, but usually one caliber off. So when we look at military firearms then, that level of variability just won't work. You've got to have some ability to share ammunition. And that's one of the most striking things about the 18th century when it comes to warfare, is the fact that firearms really take over the battlefield in the 18th century really fully for the first time, because they have not only become fairly interchangeable in terms of their parts, which is really difficult when you're doing that with hand tools, but we've found ways around that. And then also, that same thing gives them the ability to share ammunition. So this musket is one of 4 major calibers, for instance, that the British Army uses. This one, on average, usually if you look at the originals, comes out to about 76 caliber. The extant examples that we know of, that I'm aware of, go between 74 and 80 caliber. Above that, there's this monster gun called a wall gun. Now, that's actually classified as artillery, but it's averaged out at about 98 caliber. And then below the musket, you've got what we refer to as a carbine and a pistol. So carbine bore is generally 66 caliber, and pistol bore is generally 56 caliber. And that idea, again, is that they can share ammunition, and so they build things accordingly for that standard.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we have reached the time for our final question of this afternoon. But for that final question, I was wondering if you both might be able to reflect a little bit about the last 5 years at the Musket Range and maybe what your takeaways have been so far.
So one thing that I've been happy to see is that when we built the Musket Range, you kind of get an idea and who the typical type of clientele is going to be, who wants to actually come out and shoot guns. And it's honestly everybody. And not just to say that people that shoot guns, but people that don't shoot guns, people that have never touched a gun before in their life. So this is not something that is just for if you're, very enthusiastic about firearms, but instead, if you've ever been curious about firearms, if you've ever just wanted to have the experience of an 18th century firearm or a flintlock. So, we've had people ages anywhere from 14 with a legal parent or guardian all the way up to age 85 that I've seen come out and shoot. People that have, we had, young individuals from Manhattan that have never physically held a firearm before go out and their first 2 shots were both dead center bullseyes. So people that are, safely enjoying this experience from all walks of life. And I think that's been both a surprise and something that's been enjoyable, just to be able to talk with people of varying experience and various levels of interest and just really kind of explore all that. So that's one thing that I've been pleasantly surprised by out there. So yeah, regardless of your experience level.
And for me, I would say that, having seen this project from the very beginning and having to help create the system that we use and have helped hire the first people that we had, two of which we still have. Thanks for staying around, Jeff and Katie. But when you look at the experience, it's just been immensely gratifying to see that ever since the beginning, the comments have just been glowing about the experience and people's enjoyment of it. And, we honestly expected some difficulty that way because, not, hiding behind the truth. Firearms are a very political thing in our time period. And so, for us, it was really important to stay rooted in the history and to stay rooted in the experience of just trying to inform your knowledge of the past so that you understand better about how the tools work, that you can try the tools, that you can see what the tools do, and how they felt to you. And that has really borne itself out as a wonderful thing that a lot of people have taken a lot of enjoyment out of. And, and in the beginning, there were a lot of concerns that this was just admittedly a crazy idea for a museum to do this. And we still, as far as we know, are unique in having this facility, but it's really worked out well. The facilities have held up well. I will say Colonial Williamsburg really invested in this when they did it. They did it right to begin with. And it has been safe the entire time. And we strive, as our first priority to make that absolutely what you get when you come back. That it is a safe, wonderful, very engaging experience. And as far as that goes, then you can still come out. We're open year round. The ticket, a lot of people have asked, the ticket's $95, and that sounds like a lot, especially compared to a day pass. But again, when you look at the fact that you have an hour with your own instructor, and as far as the ammunition has to be handmade, so and you get a souvenir actually that was cast in Colonial Williamsburg. By our foundry. There's a lot of really cool benefits to it. And again, people who have done it have told people, if you look on Facebook and lots of other places, that it was worthwhile as an experience, that they would go back. And we have seen many people since the very beginning come back over and over again. I think our record, I don't know, you can tell me, you know better than I do. I think our record holder so far has come back 10 times.
Yep.
So, he's almost at the point where he could have bought his own musket by now, but he still keeps bringing people back because he thinks the experience is that great. And we're so grateful to have that level of patronage and, people that share that enjoyment with us.
Well, thank you so much, Seth and Justin, for sharing your expertise and experiences with us today. As we do finish up, we would like to take this opportunity to thank all of those from viewing from home. And we would also like to take this opportunity to thank our donors. Programs like this are made possible by the generous support of viewers like you. And to learn more about how you can contribute to our programming, please follow the link in the comments section or visit our website at www.colonialwilliamsburg.org. Seth and Justin, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah, well, we are just so happy to, we've managed to stay open through, most of the pandemic now. We're an outdoor experience that way, so that's great. But, as everything hopefully begins to recede, we're really, really happy to have seen the people we already have, but we invite you to come to Colonial Williamsburg to try this out along with many other things as we Keep going into the summer. It looks, by all indications, like more things may be available. And so we just can't wait to see you.